Welcome to English Stories Academy.
Chapter 1. The Mysterious Death of the Teacher. Greenville had already fallen into deep evening darkness when Lieutenant Miller, friend of Mr. Peter Jones, quietly approached his house. The low, foggy sky made the town look mysterious, and its grayness perfectly matched Miller's mood as he knocked on the door. Jones, who was already used to late visits with news of difficult cases, quickly opened the door, greeting his friend with a light nod and gesturing for him to come in. Miller, without saying a word, sat down on the chair offered to him. The soft light from the table lamp showed his tired face and tense look. Jones noticed the deep lines on his forehead and his quick, unsteady breathing, as if he was preparing to share something heavy and unpleasant.
Peter,
Miller finally spoke, feeling the support of his friend.
I need your help.
Jones, without showing any surprise, looked carefully at Miller's face, studying his every move, every expression. He knew Miller rarely looked this tense, which clearly meant the matter was serious. Slightly nodding, Jones calmly replied,
Tell me, he said gently,
allowing Miller to gather his thoughts and courage. Miller exhaled. His gaze was heavy, as if he had been carrying this weight for hours. You've probably heard of Simon Fletcher, the local teacher? A decent man, respected by everyone in Greenville. Honest, a good person. No one could imagine something bad happening to him. But recently, he was found dead in his school office. At first, it looked like a natural death. There were no signs of struggle. He was just sitting with his head down, as if he had simply fallen asleep. Jones leaned forward slightly, listening carefully to each word. His experienced look showed he understood that this story was only leading to a more important part. And Miller felt uneasy even talking about the details.
But this morning,
the coroner's report came back. Miller continued, trying to keep his voice even but slightly raising it out of worry. It turns out he was poisoned. The poison was so rare and unnoticeable that they didn't find it at first. We were just lucky that the coroner decided to run more tests. Jones watched his friend closely, catching each emotion that flashed in his voice and look. He realized that, for Miller, this case was challenging and personally important, and if he came for help, he must have felt cornered. And the evidence? Jones finally asked, breaking away from his thoughts. Miller slightly shook his head as if even he was surprised by the lack of clues.
None, Peter. No bottles, no notes, nothing.
Everything is clean, as if the criminal carefully prepared. It looks like he put his heart into hiding all traces. And the strangest thing? The poison is so rare that it's almost impossible to find. We have no leads, no clues, nothing to point to a suspect. Jones leaned back in his chair thoughtfully, his gaze distant. He understood this case required great skill, and while Miller was an excellent policeman, he felt that this type of crime needed a different approach. A rare poison, you say? Murmured Jones, looking at his old friend, as if he was already weighing the odds and forming possible scenarios in his mind. His gaze was focused, as though he was delving into the heart of the case. Then, softly sighing, he looked up at Miller. "All right, Miller, I'll take this case," he said firmly. And in his voice was the determination that brought confidence to anyone who trusted him with an investigation. Miller nodded with relief, finally handing over this burden into reliable hands, and the darkness around them seemed not as menacing. The next morning, Jones went to Simon Fletcher's house to speak with his widow, Mrs. Emily Fletcher. Approaching the door, he knocked, and after a moment, a frail woman in a black dress with red, tired eyes, as if she hadn't slept all night, opened the door. She looked exhausted but tried to hold herself with dignity, though it was clear that it was difficult for her to speak. "Mrs. Fletcher, I know this is very hard for you right now," said Jones, trying to keep his voice as soft as possible. "But I need to ask a few questions to understand what could have happened to your husband." Emily nodded quietly and invited him into the living room. The room was silent and filled with old-fashioned furniture, in a soft, dim light. It seemed that every corner of the room held memories of Simon, of his life and work. "Simon was a good man," Emily began with a restrained but trembling voice, trying to hold back her tears. "His students loved him, and his colleagues respected him. I just don't understand who could do this to him." Jones nodded, listening closely to her words. This loss was clearly a huge grief for her, and he tried to ask questions as gently as possible. "Maybe he had conflicts with any colleagues or students?" he asked carefully, studying her face. "Nothing like that," Mrs. Fletcher shook her head. "Simon always thought that a teacher should be a role model. He tried to solve all conflicts peacefully." "I'm sorry to be direct, but do you have any idea who might have wished him harm?" Jones asked, trying to catch even a hint of doubt in her eyes. "No," she whispered, lowering her gaze. "He was always honest. I don't know who could hate him enough to take his life," she said, sobbing and covering her face with her hands. Jones saw that the questions were causing her pain, and he decided to change the subject. "May I look around the house a little? Sometimes small details you might miss can help see the bigger picture." Emily nodded, and leaving her in the living room, Jones went to inspect the house. In Simon's study, he noticed neatly arranged papers and books, reflecting the strict and orderly character of the late teacher. On the desk lay financial documents, and as he flipped through them, Jones noticed that Simon had a considerable amount of money saved. This didn't match the image of a simple teacher living a modest life, as his wife described. "Interesting. Where did he get such savings?" Jones thought, studying the amounts in his accounts. For a long time, Fletcher had been a teacher at this school, where salaries were not very high. He had no inheritance, and according to Emily, they lived paycheck to paycheck. These savings didn't fit into the whole picture. He slowly closed the folder, deep in thought. Maybe Simon Fletcher was hiding something no one knew, not even his own wife. Or perhaps his death was somehow connected to this unknown source of income. Jones returned to the living room to thank Emily for her patience. Before leaving, he made one more attempt. "You mentioned that you lived quite modestly, but I noticed that Simon had some savings. Did you know about this?" Emily raised her eyebrows in surprise and shook her head. "No, he never told me about it." she whispered.
Maybe he just didn't want to worry me.
Jones nodded, understanding that she probably didn't know her husband's financial details. Saying goodbye to Emily, he left her in quiet sorrow and headed for the exit, thinking about the unexpected discovery. After talking to the widow, Jones went to the school where Simon Fletcher worked to talk to his colleagues. The school building was quiet and gloomy, as if the place itself mourned for the teacher, who seemed to be respected by everyone. Jones met several teachers in the staff room, a small room with wooden cabinets, blackboards, and the smell of chalk. The first person he spoke to was Mr. Maynor, the history teacher, who was a little older than Simon. Maynor was a man with a kind, friendly face and neat glasses that seemed to never leave his nose. He listened to Jones's questions and readily answered.
Simon was a kind of model of virtue,
he began, smiling faintly as if remembering a pleasant moment.
He always tried to do his best.
Even when people were angry at him for his strictness, everyone admitted that he was just doing his job. Sometimes he could be demanding, but, as the students said, it was only for their benefit. And yes, he never refused to help and was willing to stay late to explain something difficult to the students.
Honestly,
I find it hard to imagine who would wish him harm. Jones noted his words. The words about virtue were nice, but no virtue can guarantee the complete absence of enemies. Could no one complain about him? Not a single student who couldn't handle his strict demands? Jones asked cautiously, hoping to find something that would help him direct the investigation. Maynor paused for a moment as if remembering. There were some complaints, but, they were small things. Ordinary complaints from teenagers. Someone thought he was too strict. Someone thought he gave too hard tasks. But these are just childish whims, nothing serious. Jones nodded and thanked Maynor, after which he decided to talk to other colleagues. He noticed Miss Avery, the English teacher, in a corner of the staff room. She was sitting at a table, flipping through notebooks. And when Jones approached her, she looked up at him thoughtfully. Sorry to disturb you, Miss Avery. I would like to know about your colleague, Mr. Fletcher. I understand he was a good teacher, but perhaps there were moments when some students, or even colleagues, were unhappy with his methods. Miss Avery frowned slightly, thinking about his words.
Simon was quite pedantic, that's true, she replied slowly.
He believed that education was not only about knowledge, but also about discipline. And if someone didn't complete their assignments, he could be demanding. But I never saw it go too far. On the contrary, many of his students thanked him over time for that strictness. So you believe he couldn't have offended any of his colleagues or students? Jones insisted, noticing that she seemed to hesitate a little. Miss Avery paused, then nodded.
I think not, although, she pondered, looking away.
There was one case a couple of months ago. One of the parents came to the school and, as it seemed to me, was not very pleased. But Simon calmly explained that he acted according to the rules. It was the father of a student who was falling behind in school, and Simon insisted on extra classes. This man even threatened to file a complaint, but nothing came of it.
Oh.
Do you happen to remember this man's name? Jones asked, seeing this case as a possible lead.
Unfortunately, no, sighed Miss Avery. But we can check the attendance records. We have noted parents' visits.
Jones thanked Miss Avery, feeling that at least a small thread was starting to form. Perhaps this parent was the one who disagreed with Fletcher's methods and could see him as a threat to his child. After talking to Miss Avery, Jones went to Mr. Bennett, the vice principal of the school. Bennett, a serious man in a strict suit, listened to Jones's questions and answered briefly. I valued Simon for his high professionalism. He was a real example for the others. You don't often find such a dedicated person in our staff. I assure you none of the teachers had reasons to hold a grudge against him. As for the students, you can always understand them. They are often unhappy with demanding teachers, but that passes. What about finances? Have you ever noticed him behaving unusually? Maybe he changed his behavior in some way? Bennett raised his eyebrows, genuinely surprised by the question. Absolutely not. Simon was such an honest man that it is simply impossible to think of him as someone capable of illegal activities. Money was never his goal. He devoted everything to his work. The vice principal's words completely confused Jones. Could all that money found in the documents be some strange coincidence? In the evening, Jones returned home, feeling the weight of a long day. As soon as he entered his office, he threw his hat on the hook and sank into his favorite rocking chair by the fireplace. The quiet fire softly crackled, casting shadows on the old books neatly arranged on the shelves. Jones closed his eyes and took a deep breath, letting the silence of the night envelop him, although thoughts about the case did not leave him. The case of Simon Fletcher left a strange aftertaste. The simple death of a teacher, seemingly completely natural at first glance, suddenly turned into a mystery. There were almost no clues, and Jones felt the tension tightening around him, preventing him from finding a lead. He knew that without a new idea, without a fresh look at the situation, the investigation risked hitting a dead end. But how? What was he missing? He is just a teacher, and how much can he earn as a simple teacher? A thought flickered in his mind, and he suddenly remembered the documents he found in the deceased's house. Jones studied Fletcher's papers closely, and couldn't help but notice that although the teacher lived quite modestly, his savings were, to put it mildly, more than considerable. This fact did not fit into the overall picture. A modest teacher, respected, honest, and suddenly large sums of money. Soon this seemingly insignificant detail grew in his mind into a whole theory. Where could he have gotten the money? It is obvious that he acquired the money in some other way. Jones got up from his chair and walked to the window. Outside, a dark street covered in fog lay, and the lamps flickered in the distance, barely lighting the winding path leading to the center of the town. He rubbed his chin with his finger, thinking. Perhaps Simon Fletcher was not as simple as he seemed at first glance. Or perhaps Fletcher discovered something important, something serious enough to put his life in danger. Maybe his own money was the key to the mystery? Or perhaps his wealth attracted unwanted attention to him. Possible directions for further investigation began to take shape in the detective's mind. The money could indicate secret connections. What if Fletcher was involved in affairs that no one knew about? Or did he learn something that could cost him his life? These thoughts made Jones feel a surge of energy and determination. He knew he couldn't stop until he got to the truth. In the morning, he had a new meeting with Lieutenant Miller, and additional questions for those around him. Chapter 2. The Teacher's Secrets. Mr. Jones woke up at dawn. The first rays of morning were coming through the curtains, but the sky was still gloomy, suggesting rain. He stretched and felt tired after a long day of thinking about the case. Still, despite the fatigue, his decision was firm. He wanted to start working with a clear mind. After a quick shower, he went to the kitchen, where he prepared a simple but nourishing breakfast. An omelet, toasted bread, and strong tea. After finishing his breakfast, Jones sat at the table and reviewed the case notes once again. He decided to start the morning with a visit to the home of the late teacher Simon, to learn more about his life, habits, and surroundings. And he was curious to find out where the money in his account came from, and whether there were any acquaintances who might wish him harm. Before leaving, he carefully put on his dark coat, adjusted his hat, and prepared for another day of investigation. When he opened the door, he noticed that it had started to drizzle, and without thinking, he grabbed an umbrella. Suddenly, there was a soft knock at the door. Mr. Jones was slightly surprised, thinking it might be his colleague and friend, Lieutenant Miller, who sometimes came in the morning to discuss the case details. However, when he opened the door, he was surprised to see a middle-aged woman, plump and slightly shorter than him. She was soaked to the skin without an umbrella, and seemed eager to escape from the rain. "Hello, Mr. Jones. Will you let me in? I need to talk to you," the woman said with a slight accent, her face showing tension. "Good morning, ma'am," Jones replied, squinting slightly as he looked at her. "Of course, come in. The weather is not pleasant today." After letting the woman in, he helped her take off her wet coat and led her to the living room. They sat across from each other, and Jones looked at her closely, waiting for her explanation. "I apologize for the sudden intrusion, Mr. Jones," the woman began, looking away. "My name is Sarah Middleton. I am Simon's sister, the murdered teacher." Jones raised an eyebrow, listening to her. "I was told that you are investigating his death," Sarah continued. "I got your address from Lieutenant Miller." "My visit. It's better if no one knows about it." Jones tilted his head slightly, sensing her hidden caution, but decided not to press her and let her speak. "Of course, ma'am," he nodded, smiling gently to reassure her. "You can be sure of my confidentiality. Tell me everything you know. Any detail might be important." Sarah took a deep breath, and worry flickered across her face. "The thing is, Simon had a mistress," she began, lowering her voice. "No one knew about it except me. I don't want this information to become public because he cannot defend himself anymore, and he has children. I would like him to be remembered as a good husband and father." Jones frowned slightly, but nodded, showing that he understood her request. "I understand," he replied calmly. "But still, who is this woman?" Sarah nervously clasped her hands as if fearing that something might go wrong. "Amanda, she was his first love. They knew each other since childhood, but she married a wealthy businessman. He was a very rich man." Sarah paused, as if afraid she was saying too much. "Then Simon met his wife, Emily, and everything changed. They lived happily until Amanda reappeared in his life." "How did they meet again?" Jones asked, leaning forward a bit. "One of Simon's students was Amanda's stepson," Sarah explained. "He needed extra lessons, and the student's father asked Simon to tutor him at their home. That's when they met Amanda again. The feelings returned even though he didn't want that.
Amanda, she insisted on meeting, even threatening to tell her husband if Simon didn't see her secretly. Not a muscle on Jones's face moved, but he began to understand why Simon might have been in danger. "And you think her husband might have learned about the meetings and possibly planned something terrible?" he asked, carefully choosing his words. "Yes," Sarah whispered, nodding. "Her husband is very jealous and influential. He could hire someone to take revenge. But please, see if it turns out that he is involved in Simon's death. Do not mention that I told you about the affair. Emily will not forgive me for this, and I don't want the children to lose faith in their father's memory." "You can count on me, ma'am," Jones assured her, looking seriously into her eyes. "Thank you," Sarah nodded, looking a bit calmer. "Let me ask," Jones continued, "do you have suspicions about other people? Maybe Simon had enemies or someone who held a grudge against him?" "Well, there was one student with whom he had conflicts, but then, as far as I know, everything was resolved." This student's name was Eddie Hilton. He lives in a house next to the school. You can easily find the house. You can't miss it. A small old house is located to the left side of the school. Also, Simon had an argument with an old friend 2 years ago, with Mason Kendrick, and they stopped communicating after that. But I don't think he is connected to Simon's death, as the argument was a long time ago. Jones listened carefully, lost in thought and trying to piece together the puzzle. He decided that it was worth paying attention to possible enemies of Simon, and checking if Amanda's husband could really be so jealous and cruel. "Thank you, Miss Middleton. You provided me with important information, and I will do everything possible to find out the truth," Jones said, standing up and offering Sarah his hand to guide her to the door. As he said goodbye to her, he promised to contact her if new questions arose. And from that moment, his morning plan changed. Chapter 3. First Love. Mr. Peter Jones, dressed in his long coat and hat, stood by the majestic mansion where he had come with a secret purpose: to talk with Amanda, the first and last love of the late Simon Fletcher. The detective chose the time of his visit carefully. With the help of Lieutenant Miller, he learned that Amanda's husband, an influential and wealthy businessman, had gone on business and would not return until the evening. The mansion was luxurious, a huge facade, tall and strict, reflected the solidity and status of its owner. Peter rang the doorbell, and soon a tall and stately butler appeared at the door with a reserved yet assessing look. He led the detective inside through richly furnished rooms, decorated with expensive paintings and exquisite furniture, until they reached the living room, where Amanda was already waiting for him. She sat by a large mirror, and a young maid carefully combed her long, silky, golden hair. Amanda looked incredibly attractive, possessing that elusive sophistication that astonishes even the most steadfast person. Her blue eyes looked at Jones softly but cautiously, and her serene smile seemed to enhance her natural charm. For a moment the detective unexpectedly froze, forgetting the purpose of his visit. Her cold but captivating beauty drew his gaze. Amanda, used to such an effect on others, smiled slightly, and in that moment her aloofness seemed to disappear.
It was as if she was studying the detective, trying to understand why he had come. Silence fell, which was broken by the voice of the butler.
"Mrs. Wyndham, this is Mr. Jones, a private detective,"
he announced, looking up at the hostess. The word detective immediately caused concern on Amanda's face, though she tried to hide it behind a polite smile. She nodded slightly, and looking at the maid, and the butler quietly but confidently said,
"You may leave us,"
she commanded, indicating that the further conversation would be better in private. When the servants left the room, she pointed to a chair opposite her for Jones, and, with a gesture full of refined politeness, invited him to sit down. "How can I help you, Mr. Jones?" Amanda began, her voice even and calm, but something elusive flickered in her eyes. "I would like to talk to you about Simon Fletcher, your stepson's teacher, who recently died tragically," Jones started, trying to observe her reaction closely. A slight anxiety that flickered in her gaze confirmed his guess. Amanda knew that he would mention Simon and perhaps had been expecting the detective's visit. Her calmness was deceptive, but Jones noticed the faintest shadows of doubt passing across her face. "Mrs. Wyndham, I know about your connection with Mr. Fletcher. Please tell me the whole truth about your relationship with Simon Fletcher, and whether your husband could have found out about your affair with him and killed Mr. Fletcher out of jealousy," he asked, trying to speak gently but firmly. Amanda paled and, sighing as if giving in, lowered her eyes. "Yes, we had an affair," she confessed, clenching her hands. "We were in love. But my husband, I believe, knew nothing about it. He is a calculating and cold-blooded man. He cares more about his reputation and wealth than my loyalty or happiness." "Are you sure he didn't know? Sometimes jealousy drives people to do a lot," Jones observed, watching her reaction closely. Amanda smiled, but the smile was forced. "Believe me, my husband would not risk his reputation because of me," she replied with a sad smirk. "He loved me, but he loved money, and his freedom more than me. If he had found out, he would simply have left me with nothing, as he has done many times with his former partners. No, I don't think he knew anything. I also know that Mr. Fletcher had a significant amount of money. Given his position, this money could seem suspicious." "Do you know anything about this?" Jones asked, carefully watching her facial expression. Her face paled even more, and she clenched her hands so tightly that the knuckles turned white. "Yes, I gave him that money," she answered barely above a whisper. "We planned to leave together. I helped him save money, thinking that we could start a new life when he decided to leave his family. But he kept delaying until one day it was too late. He died." A tear rolled down her cheek, and Jones saw that despite her mistakes, Amanda was devastated by the loss. "So you do not suspect your husband?" Jones clarified, falling into thoughtful silence. Amanda shook her head. "If he had found out, he would have simply gotten rid of me by divorcing me, but not from Simon. That's not his style." But her eyes narrowed again. "A few months before Simon's death, he had a strong conflict with a student. I remember Simon complained that the boy threatened him and caused scenes. It may not matter, but I felt that this young man had a strong dislike for Simon." Jones nodded, jotting down new details in his notebook. He felt that the conversation with Amanda had provided more than he expected, and knew that his investigation now needed to include not only jealousy and money, but also hidden animosity among those whom Simon knew and taught. "Thank you, Mrs. Wyndham, for your honesty. Everything you said will remain between us," he assured her, rising and bowing slightly before leaving the luxurious mansion. Chapter 4. The Student. Mr. Jones decides to meet with the student who had conflicts with Simon Fletcher. Hoping to find a clue, he goes to the teenager's house, a modest, worn-down, and slightly crooked house in the suburbs that looked especially dreary in the gray light of the autumn morning. The boy grew up here, knowing hardships and difficulties well, and as Mr. Jones suspected, the possible reasons for the conflicts with the teacher might run deeper than simple disobedience. Approaching the house, Mr. Jones knocked on the wooden door, which was peeling from age. After a few seconds, a woman opened the door. Her facial features showed many years of hard work. She looked at the detective with surprise before inviting him to come in. "Good morning, Miss Hilton," Mr. Jones began politely, taking off his hat. "I am a private detective, Mr. Jones. I came to talk to your son about Mr. Fletcher." The woman frowned and nodded. "Eddie is in his room," she replied with a slight sigh. "I hope you do not think badly of him. He may be a bit cheeky, but he is not such a bad boy." "I understand, miss," the detective assured her. "Sometimes difficulties and misunderstandings at school hide more complicated reasons." Eddie, a tall but thin boy of about 17, came out of his room looking uncertainly at the detective. He looked tired, but it seemed that talking to a stranger did not scare him much. "Eddie, this is Mr. Jones. He wants to talk to you about Mr. Fletcher," Miss Hilton said with slight worry and left the room, leaving them alone. Mr. Jones sat down in the chair opposite Eddie, trying to keep his tone friendly. "I would like to talk about your relationship with Mr. Fletcher." "Oh," he began calmly. "I know that you had conflicts with him." Eddie snorted with dissatisfaction and looked down, as if remembering something unpleasant. "Yes, we argued sometimes," he said after a pause, "but he was the only teacher who really cared. He was tough, but I think he just wanted me to be better." He paused, thinking about his words. "He said I needed to learn so I would not repeat my mistakes." Mr. Jones watched the young man closely, noticing the sincerity in his words. "That is interesting," the detective gently remarked. "Did you ever think that he did not like you?" Eddie looked up with surprise. "No, quite the opposite. Mr. Fletcher had his own way of helping. Strict. But now I understand that he was trying to support me. He knew that my mom and I had a difficult situation, and he told me that if I did not change, it would be hard for my mom." The boy's words, spoken with a barely noticeable tremor, deeply touched Mr. Jones. "I regret our arguments," Eddie continued with bitterness. "I misunderstood him, and now it is too late to change anything. I did not want to harm him, honestly." Mr. Jones appreciated the honesty of this confession, and after a short pause asked, "Do you know if Mr. Fletcher had conflicts with anyone else? Perhaps some teachers or students held a grudge?" Eddie thought for a moment and shook his head.
No, I do not know anything about that. I only know that he wanted to help, even if he did not always know how to say it directly. And he believed that people could change if given a chance. The detective sighed, seeing only an honest, remorseful young man before him, and realized that the investigation had hit a dead end for now. He thanked Eddie for the honest conversation and, saying goodbye, left the house to return to his own. The boy's words continued to echo in his mind. Mr. Fletcher was trying to help, but perhaps his actions hurt someone much deeper. Mr. Jones returned home, feeling disappointment and tiredness. In cases as in life, there comes a moment when it seems that all efforts are in vain. The number of suspects was growing, but no specific evidence appeared. He settled into his chair and gazed thoughtfully out the window, replaying the details in his mind again and again, hoping that something he missed would finally become clear. Chapter 5. Mr. Wyndham. The case was at a standstill. Mr. Jones and Lieutenant Miller sat in silence on the porch of Jones's house. The sun was setting, and a light breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, casting long shadows on the wooden floorboards. Lieutenant Miller nervously smoked a cigarette, his gaze darting around as if searching for answers to invisible questions. Jones, deep in thought, stared into the distance. The silence stretched on, becoming almost tangible. Finally, breaking the silence, Jones spoke. His voice was quiet but firm. "So, what do we have?" he began, not taking his eyes off the horizon. Simon Fletcher seemed to be a perfect man. At least, no relatives or colleagues remembered any fights or enemies. But there is one detail. Jones cast a thoughtful glance at Miller. The mistress, Amanda Wyndham, a married woman whose husband is considered a very influential businessman. She claims that her husband would not commit murder. Supposedly, it is easier for him to get a divorce than to risk prison or the gallows. Miller smirked, leaning back in his chair and shaking the ash from his cigarette. An interesting argument. Maybe it's true, or maybe she is just lying. He took a deep drag, then continued. But how can we check this? We can't just go to Mr. Wyndham and ask, "Excuse me, did you kill your wife's lover?" Jones smiled slightly. Miller's words eased the tension but did not dispel his thoughts. He took a cigarette from the lieutenant, something he rarely did, lit it, and fell deep in thought, staring at the flame. Maybe he really didn't know about the affair. But what if he is involved? Jones said, exhaling a puff of smoke. We need to check his alibi on the day Simon was poisoned. Miller nodded, squinting thoughtfully. And what if he really didn't go anywhere? He has enough influence to hire someone else to poison Fletcher for him, noted Miller. He wouldn't get his hands dirty if he has people for the dirty work. Jones glanced at Miller, agreeing. You are right. Maybe we can find out where his close people were on the day of the murder. I need to talk to Mr. Wyndham and confirm Mrs. Wyndham's words. This is the only way to understand if she was telling the truth. Jones's face became determined, and he put aside the cigarette. Do you really think he will open up to you? Miller asked doubtfully. I doubt it, but sometimes people reveal details without knowing what we already know.
We will have to ask the right questions and watch the answers carefully," replied Jones, getting up. "Let's go. It's time to find out what this Mr. Wyndham knows." The lieutenant threw the cigarette butt on the ground and stamped it out with the toe of his boot. A few minutes later, they were on their way. The drive to Wyndham's office took some time, and as the car slowly moved through the streets of the town, Jones and Miller discussed the details of the case as if navigating through thick fog. When they arrived at the office, they saw an impressive building with tall windows that reflected the strict lines of Mr. Wyndham himself. They entered a spacious hall, and the secretary led them to the businessman's office. Wyndham was waiting for them, sitting behind a massive oak desk. His face was impassive, his gaze predatory and sharp. "Mr. Wyndham," Jones began, barely glancing at his counterpart. "We would like to ask you a few questions regarding Mr. Fletcher, your son's teacher." Wyndham's face remained stone-like, but a flicker of irritation passed in his eyes. "For what purpose, if it's not a secret? I have the right to choose who teaches my son." "Of course," Jones replied calmly. "However, the circumstances require verification. As we know, Mr. Fletcher was poisoned, and since rumors say you were jealous of your beautiful wife for the teacher, we need to rule out all possible options." "I was jealous of my wife for a simple teacher? Do you really think I am involved in this?" Wyndham asked mockingly, raising an eyebrow. Jones calmly nodded. "We are just checking all possible versions, Mr. Wyndham. It would be helpful to know where you were on the day of his death." The businessman smirked. "Perhaps you doubt my integrity?" he said coldly. "I will not answer stupid questions without a lawyer. If you have no evidence, I would recommend you search for the guilty among others. But still, I will respond to your silly statement about my wife. I do not know who spread such rumors, but I will tell you this. Amanda wouldn't even look at that poor teacher. Where is my wife? Where is he? Don't make me laugh." Jones and Miller exchanged glances. It was clear that the businessman was not going to cooperate. But Jones noticed that behind this mask of confidence and irritation, something else was hiding, perhaps fear, barely perceptible but still real. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Wyndham," Jones said, getting up. "I hope we will not trouble you again. However, if we have new questions, we will contact you." They left the office. Lieutenant Miller looked at Jones when they were already outside. "Did you notice? He was nervous." Jones nodded, thoughtfully gazing at the building. "He has something to hide. The question is what exactly?" After visiting Mr. Wyndham, Mr. Jones suggested to Lieutenant Miller that they go to the home of the late Simon to examine his banking documents. The detective believed that the answer to the murder of the simple teacher might lie in his bank accounts, as there were considerable amounts there. Jones felt that they needed to search in a different direction. Despite Wyndham's irritation and suspicion, his involvement was still in question, and Jones did not like to rush to conclusions. When they arrived at the home of the late teacher, Mrs. Fletcher, the teacher's wife, was at home. She let the detective and the lieutenant into her husband's office. "All his belongings are as they are. Nothing has been touched," the woman said. "I hope you find what you are looking for," she continued. "Thank you. You are very polite," said the detective. The two men began to dig through the letters and documents. They thought that all the letters the deceased had received in the last months and all the bank documents could be important for the investigation. They put all the necessary documents into one box and headed for the exit. "Mrs. Fletcher, in this box are all the letters and bank documents of your husband. We need to examine them to learn more about your husband. There may be secrets that you might not know, so we need these documents," said the detective. "But do not worry. We will return everything safely after the investigation," he continued, trying to calm the widow. "Yes, of course, do what you think is necessary, detective." "The most important thing is to find my husband's killer," the woman said. "We will definitely find the criminal, do not worry," the detective replied confidently. Chapter 6. Blackmail. Late in the evening, Jones sat at his desk, intently studying the bank reports related to the case. His attention was drawn to documents hidden in a small envelope. It contained several large transfers that Simon Fletcher had regularly sent to someone named Mason Kendrick over the past few months. Jones remembered how Simon's sister had talked about Simon's old friend, with whom he had a fight. They stopped talking after the argument. So why is Simon sending him large amounts of money now? Very interesting, thought the detective. Jones frowned. The amounts were too large for a teacher's usual expenses, and the transfers were labeled as personal loans, which looked suspicious. Calling Lieutenant Miller, Jones began to explain his finding. "Miller, look at this. Every 2 weeks, Simon sent money to Mason's account. And these are quite large amounts for someone with a teacher's salary. It's obvious that personal loans mean something else. Moreover, 2 years ago, they had a fight and stopped talking. Yet now Simon is sending him large amounts? Why is that?" Miller nodded thoughtfully. So, Fletcher might have been trapped. Perhaps Mason blackmailed him, which is why he had to send him large sums. But what was he blackmailed with? Jones continued to think aloud. According to our data, Simon had a secret affair with Amanda, the wife of a businessman, and apparently Mason found out about it. He decided to use this information to make Simon pay. I think Fletcher initially tried to pay off Mason to keep him quiet, but then something changed. "And you think Simon decided to fight back?" asked Miller, leaning in closer. Jones nodded. "I think so. He might have tried to break free by exposing something that Mason had done. Perhaps he found a clue that could put his blackmailer in danger of prison. But what exactly did Simon find out?" Miller scratched his head, pondering. Mason must have realized that his scheme could come to light. Then he decided to get rid of Simon completely to protect himself. Jones nodded, thinking. He used poison, rare and expensive, hoping that no one would guess how Simon died. This was probably the only solution for Mason, who couldn't afford to take any risks. All of these were just guesses. Now Detective Jones and Lieutenant Miller had to prove it. "We need to search Simon's house again." Maybe we missed something," said the detective. "Yes, I think another search won't hurt," agreed Miller. The next day, they conducted another thorough search of Simon Fletcher's house. The search took a long time and was exhausting, but in one of the desk drawers, Jones came across an old, slightly worn notebook filled with small handwriting. "Miller, look at this," called Jones, flipping through the pages. The notebook turned out to be something like a diary or notebook in which Simon carefully recorded meetings and communications with Mason. Among the notes were mentions of how Mason demanded money from him, threatening to reveal his affair with Amanda. But then new entries appeared. Simon made notes about suspicious activities in which Mason was involved. In a few lines, the words money laundering and government contracts flashed. "It seems Simon found something big," Miller said thoughtfully, studying the text. "These notes about government contracts and illegal transfers could be a real bomb." Jones nodded, turning to the next page. Apparently, Simon decided that if Mason didn't leave him alone, he would expose his schemes. And when Mason realized that Fletcher was about to go to the authorities, he resorted to murder. Later, contacting a financial expert he knew, Jones asked him to check Mason's bank accounts to understand how the money laundering was happening. After several hours spent on the documents, the financier informed Jones that Mason had a secret account through which millions of pounds passed, supposedly for consulting services. Jones, feeling that the case was close to being solved, discussed it again with Miller. "Now it's clear, Miller. Mason used connections in the government to get contracts, and then transferred money through shell companies and fake accounts. And Fletcher was apparently going to expose this." "You're right, Jones. If this became known, Mason would face not just prison, but a huge scandal, and his empire would collapse instantly. But when Fletcher found out the truth, he was already a dead man." Detective Jones and Lieutenant Miller headed to the police station to confront the previously summoned Mason Kendrick. Mason sat across from Jones and Miller, clearly nervous but trying to maintain an appearance of calm. The detective laid out the bank reports and copies of the transfers in front of him. "Mr. Kendrick," Jones began, crossing his arms, "explain why Mr. Fletcher was sending you such significant amounts. The amounts that clearly exceed normal debt repayments." Mason smirked, trying to appear confident. "Simon was just paying back a debt," he said with a hint of sarcasm. "That money was part of an old agreement. We have been friends for a long time, you know." Jones narrowed his eyes, studying his reaction. "And you want us to believe that a teacher, who everyone says barely made ends meet, suddenly decided to pay back an old debt with such large sums?" Miller, sitting next to him, nodded and added, "What about the personal loans label on the bank transfers? That's a convenient cover for something else, isn't it?" Mason hesitated, but quickly regained his composure and tried to change tactics. "Fine, Simon paid me. But these are just personal matters that have nothing to do with murder." Jones smiled, opening the next folder of documents, which contained the results of the analysis of the government contract schemes. "Now let me explain what we found out. The accounts we checked indicate systematic money laundering, with amounts passing through several shell companies and ultimately ending up in your personal account. Simon discovered these schemes, didn't he? And you understood that his words could ruin your career and life." Mason turned pale and his confidence began to crumble. He tried to say something, but the words got stuck in his throat. "You started blackmailing Fletcher because of his relationship with Amanda, a married woman. He was paying you large sums. Then, tired of playing your game, Simon sought compromises with you. And when he found out about your illegal activities, Jones continued, you realized that the end was near. And then you resorted to your last resort, murder. Mason rubbed his face, showing fatigue and understanding that he could no longer escape. Okay, he finally mumbled. Yes, I killed him. He knew too much. But it was his fault for getting involved in things he shouldn't have. Miller looked at Jones. Justice has been served, Jones. Jones merely nodded, satisfied that the truth was revealed and another criminal would be punished. Chapter 7. Hope for the Better. Late in the evening, Detective Jones sat at home thinking about the case when there was a knock at the door. Amanda Wyndham stood on the doorstep. Her beauty and elegance caught the attention of Miller, who was already visiting Jones. The lieutenant could not take his eyes off her refined features and perfect outfit, although it was clear that Amanda looked a bit nervous. Mr. Jones, I'm sorry for the late visit, Amanda began as she sat down in the chair. But I need to talk to you about an important decision I have made. Of course, Mrs. Wyndham, Jones replied, listening carefully to her. I'm all ears. Amanda sighed, looked around the room, and hesitating slightly, spoke. I can no longer stay married to a man I never loved. I have decided to get a divorce, and I want to do something to possibly make up for my guilt to Simon's family. Her voice trembled. All the money I transferred to Simon's account I will give to his wife and children. But it is important to me that his wife knows the truth. I believe I am partly responsible for his death. Jones and Miller exchanged glances, understanding how difficult this decision must be for Amanda. Jones nodded, confirming the seriousness of her words. I think this is a fair step, Mrs. Wyndham. I can accompany you to Mrs. Fletcher if you are ready to tell her everything now, Jones offered. Thank you. Yes, that would be better. Amanda sighed and nodded. Half an hour later, they arrived at Mrs. Fletcher's house. Amanda paused for a moment at the door before she resolutely knocked. Mrs. Fletcher, still deep in mourning, opened the door and invited her guests inside. Amanda took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice quiet but confident. Mrs. Fletcher, it is hard for me to talk about this, but I feel that I must confess, Simon and I had a relationship. I never wanted to hurt you, but now that he is gone, I understand that the truth must be told. She looked into Mrs. Fletcher's eyes. I was a comfort to him, but he truly loved only you and your children. He spoke of you with respect and warmth. As they said goodbye, Amanda promised to support her and the children financially, transferring those very funds. They exchanged brief nods, and Jones noticed that Miller, slightly embarrassed, offered to drive Amanda home. I would be happy to. Amanda agreed with a slight smile as she took his hand. As they left, Jones watched them with a light smile. He felt relieved, knowing that his friend Miller might find happiness with Amanda, and that justice in this matter had prevailed.
Like, share, and subscribe to our channel.